Alright, so the theme for the past couple weeks on this channel and across my social media accounts is fursona species, and we just got done reviewing a bunch of them in short little micro reviews. And of course, that list was mostly filled with mammals, which makes sense in the furry fandom. But we've also gone over a couple of reptiles, some birds, and other animals that are, for lack of a better term, real animals. Now, when it comes to making a fursona, there really isn't any rule that states that the species that it's based on has to be a real animal. In fact, furries in this fandom make fursonas out of creatures that aren't real all of the time. Statistically, the biggest example of this is dragons, but there are a whole host of other animals or animal-like creatures that get adopted into fursonas all of the time, including things like cryptids, for example. But even still, those animals are still coming from an external shared understanding that most people had of those animals before they chose to use them in becoming a furry. In other words, people outside of this fandom will probably also have some kind of understanding of what a dragon or what a jackalope is. And for some members of the fandom, even that isn't unique enough to create a fursona from. They're looking for something a lot more closely tied to the fandom itself, something that might even originate from the community at large. And that's where original species come in. These are fictional species of animals that were either created by furries or used almost exclusively in the furry fandom. There's a bunch of them out there and you can find examples of them everywhere online, but today I really don't want to talk about what these species are. I more want to talk about why they exist in the first place. What was the motivation behind going out of our way to create very detailed, fantastical species just to use as our identities in the fandom? Or to put it simply, what's the point of furry original species? It's always fun to explore this question because if you think about it, furries are really spoiled when it comes to character design. We literally have the entire animal kingdom to choose from and make fursonas out of, to the point where, if we're being technical, the number of distinct animal species more than likely outnumbers the number of furries that there are, meaning if we really wanted to, everyone could be their own unique species in this fandom. But of course, that's not what happens, and for good reason. Part of the whole fursona making process is starting with an animal that you relate with on some level. Though it doesn't have to be that deep of a level. Some furries choose their fursonas simply because they think a certain animal looks cool, but many other furries have pretty well developed reasonings behind choosing a certain animal over another in this fandom. And even then, if you can't choose between one or another, you can combine two or more and create a hybrid species, thereby increasing the number of possibilities for choosing a fursona exponentially, to the point where you can get very specific about the species that represents your fursona. And yet, almost despite of all that, there are still so many of you furries that choose blue dogs or wolves as your sonas. You have all of that at your disposal and you still choose something so basic, so rudimentary, so amateurish. Why do you do that to yourselves? But all jokes aside, the main point is that there are a wealth of options when it comes to choosing an animal for a fursona, and more often than not, members of this fandom will choose an animal that is real or fictional, but still well known, and use that as the basis of their identity in this fandom. And yet, even that is still not enough for some furries. There are a great number of people in this fandom that don't want to choose a real animal to base a character off of like everyone else, and yearn for something even more unique. So to solve this problem, some members of the community created certain species that were designed for use in the fandom itself. These are what we call original species, as they originated from the furry fandom and have no equivalency or relevance outside of the fandom itself. And like I said, there are a bunch of them, with ones like Protogen, wicker beasts, Dutch angel dragons, manakits, and Sergals being some of the more popular ones. And it's not like these were randomly thought up one day. No, most original species in this fandom have a deep backstory of their design and detailed lore describing where they came from. Some have even gone through updates over time and have committees tasked with overviewing the general health and reputation of an original species at large. It's a pretty sizable and very important part of this fandom, and I encourage you to do some research into any of the ones that look interesting to you. Even if you have no intention of basing a character off of them, just reading through some of their lore or watching a video explaining their history is fascinating on its own. But again, that's not what we're trying to accomplish in this video. Now that we have a basic understanding of what furry original species are, let's take a look at the why. Why did furries come up with these for use in the fandom at all? Well, from what I've seen, there are three major reasons that stick out amongst the rest regarding why furry original species exist. The first has to do with something we've been alluding to already in this video, wanting to be unique. The creation of an original species allows people to design and use unique, imaginative creatures that may draw some inspiration from existing animals, but are otherwise totally different from animals that are real or generalized in fiction. By doing this, the people who created these original species and the people who adopted them as fursonas are forced to be creative in the design process, taking something that has no equivalent in the real world and making it work as an identity in this fandom. It may end up being more work in the end, but the result ends up being something that does stand out from the crowd, which invites intrigue and questions and conversations from other members of the community, which at the end of the day is what this community was designed to invite in the first place. Speaking of community, another positive side effect that the development of original species has is the formation of a community around the species itself. This is something that you see with more popular original species in this fandom, where furries who have personas of that creature find and participate in community inside the fandom at large. Honestly, it's a lot like having their own fandom within the fandom, and they treat it like such by doing things like meetups and events and having online and offline group activities that members who are a part of that original species can participate in. This may be especially attractive to someone who may be concerned about finding an initial group of friends in the fandom that is accelerating in growth. And finally, I think many people underestimate how much of the lore and the world-building aspect of original species draws people to make characters with them. Now, we're kind of drawing conclusions based on other evidence here, but there are a lot of members in this fandom who really like the type of thinking that it takes to create a fantasy world and the lore behind the species that makes up that world. It's the same line of thinking that goes into things like tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, where while there are some general guidelines, the setting of those games is entirely up to the players and how they decide they want their world to look. That way of thinking about characters and personas can really resonate with many people in this fandom, and creating original species or instances of already developed species works the same line of thinking as speculative fiction or fantasy games, which leads a lot of people to want to make a character or persona that acknowledges that interest. Now, I'm sure there are a bunch of other smaller reasons why original species have been created and used. Thankfully, it's not so much like this anymore, but the commercialization of creating species that other people needed licenses to use could be pretty profitable, and in turn, the exclusivity aspect of having something that only had a limited run or had to be paid for had its own draw as well. But we're seeing less and less of that nowadays, and now it's simply considered another creative option when it comes to making a persona in this community. And it's an option that works very well for a lot of people. I would say that the ecosystem of original species is very healthy, and new ones bubble up in popularity pretty often these days. Of course, it's not going to be for everyone, but it's good to have as many options as you can when creating a character that acts as your identity in this fandom. So don't expect these original species to fall out of favor in the fandom anytime soon. In a fandom based so much on artistic creativity, making and using one is actually one of the most furry things that you can do. Alright, thank you for watching. I'll catch you in the next one, but until then, stay wild out there. Peace.